Welcome to Casual Friday. This week I have some knitting tidbits. I have an update on some knitting art that I showed you a couple of weeks ago. And this week I want to talk again about knitting experimentation. So let's get started. So one of the things that I usually start every video with is a declaration that if you would like to jump from one section of the video to another, that there are time-stamped links down in the video description. That is going to remain true, but there is a new feature in YouTube that is in beta right now, which means that some of you will have that ability and some of you will not. And it's going to improve the ability to use and access those time-stamped links. If you are using an Apple mobile device, typically you can see what time each section of the video starts when you're looking in the video description, but you can't actually click on the link. That has been a problem for a while. If you have an Android device or you're on a desktop computer, then you can do that. The new feature that's getting rolled out is going to allow you to do that from the actual video screen, that you will be able to access each section of the video, see where it is from the timeline within the video screen. And you will also be able to see what those sections are called. Now, it's going to be available for every kind of device. It will only be available if you are actually on YouTube while you are watching the video. So if you're watching from an embedded link, you won't be able to see it. But I want to show you what it looks like. So I've done a little recording to show you what it's going to look like and how some of you might be able to use this right away. Others are going to have to wait for a little bit. So when you look at a video, then I have the description down here and always says show more. And this down here is where I have the time-stamped links. And these work if you're working on a desktop system or on an Android. You can just click on one of these time-stamped links like this, and it will bring you right to that particular point in the video. What's happening now is that as long as I have a timestamp that is marked 0:00, then I can get these little marks along the timeline here. You see these little vertical lines that show the different section. But as I move this finger along, this is called scrubbing right here when I come along here, you can see not only where the section starts, but you can see what I have called it. Like this section right here is called calculating the hat circumference and choosing the ribbing. If there's a particular spot that I want to go to right here, like, that she said something about planning the crown of the hat, that's what I want to listen to, so I can jump to write that to that point in the video. And you can also see that at the bottom that section name is showing up right there. That's the same thing that you will see down here in the video description. So what this means is that, so many people don't go to the video description. So if you're just watching this, you will be able to do this along there. Not everybody can do it yet. But what's nice about this is that there will be some people, it works on desktop, Android, and then various iOS systems, so, iPads and iPhones. It doesn't work yet for everybody. It's in beta right now, which means they're testing it out to see how it works, and if there's problems that they can then fix before it gets rolled out to everyone. And in addition, I don't have this working yet on all of my videos. Like I mentioned, I have to have this bit right here with the timestamp that says 0:00, and I've never had that before. So far I've done that to the videos that were from this year, And I've done, you know, some of the ones from the end of 2019. So I just need to go back in time and do that and add this to every single one of the descriptions. So that's something that some of you will be able to see now, and on at least some of my videos, and some of you aren't going to be able to see that or access that at all. So again, this is in beta, which means that not everyone has access to it, and just because somebody has put time-stamped links in their video descriptions doesn't mean that you're going to be able to see it now either, because they have to have that 0:00 timestamp in their description. So I've only done the past few months so far, and I need to go back and edit the description of all of my previous videos and to add that to make that feature available on my videos. And so those of you who were lucky enough to get this feature will be able to use it on the videos that I've done so far. And then pretty soon, at some point, they will roll it out to other people. We first noticed this feature maybe a month ago. My husband noticed it in a video that he was watching, and he sent me a link to a video, and he said, oh, look at this. This is so great. He's got these timestamped, and look what they're going along in the timeline. And I looked at the video, and I wasn't getting those little vertical lines that showed me each of the time-stamped links. But now I do have that ability. So I thought, since I have the ability to actually use it, that I would also update my video descriptions so that those of you who can use it can do it now, and those of you who will get it in the future will be able to do it at some time. So the next tidbits that have come up in my social media feed, the next one is that the Minnesota State Fair has been canceled. It's normally the 12 days at the end of August and beginning of September. The last day of the fair is Labor Day here in the United States. What is so great about the Minnesota State Fair is not just the general greatness of the state fair, but it has the best knitting competition of any state fair. So we are a big state fair. We're in a northern climate. We have a lot of people living here who are descended from Northern Europeans who immigrated here with a knitting tradition that didn't go away because of the climate that they lived in. We have very cold climate here, and so people continue to knit when they immigrated. And so we have that combination of features in our state and our state fair that make the knitting competition just amazing. So the past few years I've done videos on our state fair knitting competition, and it's going to make me sad that I can't do it this year, because the other thing that I love about the state fair is volunteering. So the Weavers Guild, which includes weaving, spinning, and dyeing, always has a booth in the Creative Activities building every year, every day of the fair. They're the only organization that does that has a booth every day like that. And so I would always volunteer to demonstrate spinning. I've done that the past couple of years, and I've gotten to know other members of the Weavers Guild that way. It's been really fun. And I always volunteer for the Knitters Guild booth, which is in the same actual larger booth area. The Minnesota Knitters Guild on the very first day of the fair always has knitting demonstrations, so I've always volunteered for that, and I just enjoy it so much, and I'm going to really miss not being able to do that. We knew it was coming, but they really delayed making that decision because they didn't want to pare it down, have a smaller scale fair. It was either going to be all or nothing, and they've made the decision for nothing. So the next thing that I wanted to bring up was that the website that was originally known as Craftsy and then became Bluprint is going to be closing down. So a lot of people, when it was Craftsy, you would buy classes, and you could buy classes from all sorts of nationally known, internationally known knitting instructors, and those were supposed to be yours forever, that you could always access by going to the website and looking at it. At one point, Craftsy was purchased by another company, which is part of NBC Media, big media conglomeration here in the United States, and they have decided to shut it down. And so when it became Bluprint, when Craftsy was bought, it became Bluprint, and it became a subscription service, a monthly subscription service. you could buy 1 month at a time, or you could cancel at any time. And while you had a subscription, you could look at any of the videos that they had, but it wasn't a forever thing. It wasn't like previously with Craftsy, where you actually bought the class and you owned it, or you owned access to it from then on. So they haven't announced when it's actually, like, the date it's going to end, and they are creating ways for people to be able to continue to access the classes that they purchased originally. One of my YouTube subscribers started a discussion thread in my Ravelry group about Bluprint Craftsy, and so I'm going to leave a link down in the video description for that, and so you can read about the different information about it and the different ways that people have discovered for how you can download the classes in order to keep them. So the company is apparently going to be announcing in general, emailing customers about how they can do that. But in the meantime, people have been finding out different ways that they can do that. So if you were a subscriber of Bluprint, or if you ever bought Craftsy classes, a lot of times people would buy them when they were on sale, and save them for when they needed them, and never watch them. So if you are in that situation, you might be interested in that. So again, I'll leave a link down in the video description to the discussion thread that's in my Ravelry group, where you can find out a bit more information. The next thing, Vogue Knitting is going to reduce the number of issues they publish to 2 issues per year in the fall. And I just read something, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that their plan is that they'll go back up to 3 issues, but they are shrinking right now. They also published a magazine called, I think it was called Knit Simple, or Knit Simple, I think it was called. That is just going to cease publication, and they are going to continue publishing Vogue Knitting, but fewer issues per year for the time being, with the plan that they will go back up to 3 issues. They made a subsequent announcement that they have a new editor, and that editor is Nora Gahn. So she is an amazing designer. I love her designs. She's one of the few designers where I actively look for her designs, and I have knit more things of hers in terms of sweater type garments than I probably have of any other designer outside of myself. So I will leave information down in the video description about those announcements as well. So a couple of weeks ago, I was showing you the sort of knitting related art that I have in my office. And I showed you 3 different things, one of which is still available from the artist and from her Etsy shop. And the other 2, one of which I wasn't sure what the origins was of it at all. And the other one was from an artist illustrator that I had bought from before, and it was no longer in her Etsy shop. Well, it turns out I'm Facebook friends with her, because when I found out about her, it was through another illustrator artist friend of mine, who is also a knitter, and she had posted this picture of this particular piece of art. And so I had contacted the artist. Her name is Jamie Hogan. I'd contacted her at the time and said, oh my gosh, I'd love to get a copy. And so she ended up at the time printing up some number of copies, and she sold through all of them. And this was a number of years ago. This is probably 6-7 years ago, something like that. So she wasn't selling them anymore in her Etsy shop. Well, a friend of hers saw me talking about it, and then apparently a couple of you had contacted Jamie and said that you would like to get those prints. So let me show you, remind you of, so it's called The Land of Knit. And she is the artist who did all of the illustrations for Stephanie Pearl McPhee's book, Stephanie Pearl McPhee Casts Off. She did this map. I don't know if this map was actually part of that book or if she just did it in conjunction with it. I don't know. But anyway, Jamie found out that I was talking about it, and several of you asked to get it. So she has printed up some more copies, and it is now available again in her Etsy shop. So I will link to that down in the video description. So if you saw that and were like, oh man, it's too bad I can't get that, you can get it now. So So that's cool. The other thing that I was showing you was this that I got from somebody. It was like a door prize at a retreat I went to a number of years ago, and I just loved it. And when I was showing it to you, I kind of looked down at the bottom and I saw that there was a copyright. It said copyright Mary Evans, and yet it was pretty clear that there was an artist's signature right here. And I was like, well, that's weird. How could Mary Evans have copyrighted this painting that she didn't own? And several of you went on a hunt on the internet and searched down what the information was, because I had never even noticed that before. I happened to notice it when I was putting it down, and had this thought of like, how could she have copyright? Turns out Mary Evans is a woman. She and her husband, back in the 60s when they were newly married, they started collecting old photographs and printed materials. And they had this huge collection, and somebody mentioned to them, you know, you should really, do something with this collection. And so she and her husband, and mostly it was her, it sounds like, turned this into a business so they would license these artworks. So, so that piece of artwork is available through that company. It still exists, Mary Evans. And so that image is available. So this particular thing, somebody bought a license to print this and then put it on this board. Now, whether they did it just independently for themselves or if they produced multiple copies that they sold at some point, I don't know. But that image is available to be licensed, and you could purchase a license for it if that was something that you wanted to do for yourself, if you wanted to get a print and put that on your wall. So I will leave a link to the Mary Evans. I have no idea how much that image would cost. They don't have pricing on their website, and I imagine that's because they have thousands and thousands of pieces of artwork, and the licensing probably varies by piece of artwork. I don't know, but I'll leave a link down in the description. In that same video where I was showing you my knitting art, I was talking about knitting experimentation. What I was talking about in that video was basically not fearing the instruction that you don't understand or can't visualize when you read it, that often you need to be in the situation in which you need to work those instructions before it becomes obvious what you're supposed to do. So a number of you had talked about how, yes, you had learned to trust the pattern, and that one of the things that you were able to do but still not understand was short rows. And I totally understand that. So you might see some instructions for short rows. You might even know you're going to be doing short rows, and you don't know what is going to happen. You follow the directions, you get the expected result, and you're like, I still don't know what just happened. And I totally understand that, because that's how I felt for probably the first 4 years I was using short rows. I realized that this trick of, well, just trust the instructions and follow them was working, but I wasn't understanding it. And so I set out to try as many different patterns as I could that used short rows in different ways to see if I could kind of get it. And I still struggled. And then there was a day when I had an epiphany. So I recognize that this is an issue. And I also asked you guys last week about what you would prefer for a topic for my next live stream. I said it was going to be Sunday, June 1st. That's a date that doesn't exist. It's going to be Sunday, May 31st. So that's this Sunday, 2 p.m. Central Daylight Time. I gave you guys a choice of, did you want me to talk about gauge, short rows, or socks? A few of you wanted gauge. Quite a few wanted socks, but many of you said, please do short rows. A lot of you want both short rows and socks, but you want short rows first. So I think that this video, my plan is it will probably be, again, about an hour long. But this time, rather than having it be an Ask Me Anything, it's going to be, I'm going to talk a bit about short rows and go through some of the things. Many of you, when you said you wanted me to do short rows, said, because I don't understand, you know, this situation, or I don't understand how to choose between different types of short row techniques. How do I know which one is the best one to use? Or I understand that where to use them, and I can do them, but I don't understand how to do them myself if I want to add them, or how to approach doing that. What's the formula for it? Those kinds of questions. So what I'm going to do is start out with basically a lesson, and I'm not sure how long that lesson is going to be. I will answer questions about what I'm actively teaching as we go, and as I see them. And then once I'm done with that lesson, I'll open it up to just short row questions. It could be things that I talked about, or could be things I hadn't brought up yet at all. So that's my plan for this weekend's live stream. So again, Sunday, May 31st, 2 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So if you are in the UK, I think that will probably be 8 p.m. your time. And if you are in continental Europe, at least the western part, I think that will be 9 p.m., I think. So it seemed like it was a good time good time to get more people from more countries participating. And so and it was a good time for me as well. So that's what we're going to go with. So another thing I've been experimenting with is how to avoid the holes at the corners of where a peasant heel or plain heel meets the instep. So I have done a video on tips and tricks for heel flaps, where there's a really good solution for eliminating or avoiding holes and gaps at those corners, and that works really well. But the way that the stitches are situated and the way that the rows of knitting are, the direction that each set of stitches is being knit is different when you're doing an afterthought sort of heel or peasant heel, that kind of thing, like I was demonstrating in Tuesday's video. And it's a problem that I have worked on and off over the years, every time I have a project that calls for that kind of an opening. And I'll fiddle around with it a few times until I get something that I think works for that particular project. I'm never 100% satisfied with that I've nailed a process, but I'm usually happy enough with the result that I get for my project. But I've never been happy enough that I wanted to do a technique video on how to avoid those holes or gaps in the corners of these types of heels. But because I've been knitting so many of these types of heels, it isn't just like, well, I try a few things while I'm working on this project and then, you know, and then I'm going on to some other project. No, the next project has got the same exact problem. So I keep working on this problem, and I have come up with a solution that I really like. I have solved the problem, and so I'll just show you a little overhead of what it looks like, the solution looks like. Okay, so this is simulating cuff down, and here's the little heel, and you can see the corner right here looks very nice. And if we look on the other side, we can see that that corner looks very nice. There's no hole. This stitch right here is a little gappy, but that's not a problem, and that actually that tension could be adjusted. The yarn tail is right here, and it's pulling on something up there. So I could still use that yarn tail to weave in if I thought this was a problem, either by just doing duplicate stitch or something like that. But so I'm really happy with this particular result. So my problem with this solution is it's not as simple as I would like. So I've solved the problem, but I need to simplify the solution and the process for executing the solution. So I actually have about 3 different ways of solving this problem. And each method works at least some of the time in certain setups. And so I'm really looking for one solution, and have it be simple enough that people can not only understand what's supposed to be done, but that they can actually make that happen. So that's another thing I've been working on, and I came up with the solution I just showed you. I came up with that yesterday, and I was so happy when it worked. So I'm going to keep working on that, and so that will probably be a video in the next couple of weeks. I have some more things to do with plain heels coming up, with modifying them, that I'm going to be doing, but I will be doing a video on avoiding those gaps right there. I just want to also test it into some other scenarios that I think they could be useful, and then for sure I'll know how well it works in different situations. Another way I do experimentation is when I come across or hear about a technique that I'm not really familiar with. I don't know when the technique might be typically used, how people might be using it in alternative ways, if there are multiple ways of getting the exact same end result, that may not, the techniques to get there might be so different it might not be obvious that you're going to get the same result. Or are there variations of things where the technique is worked very similarly but slightly different, and what would be the advantage or disadvantage of working it one way versus the other? So those are the kinds of things that I look at. I like to look at multiple sources and gather up the different sources I have, and then come up with a plan for how I'm going to experiment. So I got a comment on one of my YouTube videos sometime in the past couple of weeks. It was a video on how to eliminate or reduce dog ears at the corners of a graft for a sock toe, because the sock toes are kind of angled like this, and then when you do the graft, you can sometimes get at the very beginning and end, the stitches kind of stick up a little bit. And so there are various ways of avoiding that, and I've done, I think, 3 different videos on different techniques that all result in avoiding the dog ears. This was one where the person wanted to know, could I use the Russian graft in combination with this technique? Now, the stitches are kind of tight, and I'm not sure it can be done or not. And I didn't have an answer because I'd heard of the Russian graft and I'd seen it, but I didn't really know if there would be any issue with combining it with the technique I was demonstrating or not. And so it had been a couple of years since I had seen the Russian graft. I think it came across my Twitter feed in an Instagram video of some sort or something like that. And I looked at it, and my response was, well, that's not grafting. And I wasn't sure why somebody would choose to use that technique rather than grafting. And so I just kind of let it go. So there were a couple of things that I could guess about Russian grafting. One is that there's probably a reason why people were calling it Russian grafting. I didn't know what that reason might be, but there's probably a reason. Probably is used in some sort of Russian traditional knitting situation. Secondly, I was pretty sure that there are probably other names for it. And I was pretty convinced that it wasn't really grafting at all. But I didn't really know how it was constructed or what the situations were that where it might actually be beneficial to use. I had dismissed it as being not grafting, and it's not, but that didn't mean it wasn't useful. I just didn't know what it might be useful for. So these are the kinds of questions I want to answer when a technique is new to me. Is, how is it done? What are the variations? When is it useful? Why would you want to use one variation versus another? Is there a best way to use that or a best scenario for it? All of those kinds of questions. And then when you look at all the different ways of doing it, do they end up with slightly different results, or are some of them that look to be very different from each other, do they actually end up with exactly the same result? They're just completely different way of approaching it. And why would you choose to approach it one way versus another way? So those were all kinds of questions that I just sort of have in general. And so then my next step is to gather up as many written sources for this technique. And the reason I like to find written sources rather than just going to YouTube is because it's much easier for me to compare side-by-side written sources than to look at one video after another and either take notes or try to remember something that is subtle that I may not have noticed from one to the other. If I have the written instructions, it's much easier for me to know what is the same, what's different, and what to look for. And then at some point I'll look at a video or two and be able to tell, oh, they're doing the same thing. That one, I don't need to look at the whole thing. This is the same. Oh, ooh, this is something different. So I start with written materials and then I go to video materials. The other thing is that I never assume that somebody is demonstrating something incorrectly, even if it's different from the way that I'm used to it. I always want to evaluate, why are they doing it differently than this other way? Because there's always multiple ways of getting to the same endpoint. So I didn't start with videos. I started by Googling, and I was getting some video results, but I was quickly looking to see, is this a blog posting or a written tutorial, and I found two of them right away. And one of them was using it at the end of, basically at the end of a sock toe, but it was like a Christmas stocking sock toe. And they had a very specific reason for wanting to use that particular the Russian grafting. And so I looked at how they were setting it up. I'm like, okay, let me look at the next one. Well, the next video, or the next tutorial was doing it on a couple of garter stitch swatches or some smaller swatch, and explained that this was a technique that was frequently used in Orenburg shawls. So then I know why it's called Russian grafting. It's Orenburg shawls are a traditional Russian type of lace shawl. That's about all I know about Orenburg shawls. I'm not a lace knitter, I'm not a shawl knitter, so I really don't investigate that. In fact, the term Orenburg shawl came up a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said, what tradition is that from? And I was like, I knew it was Eastern Europe, and I was thinking maybe it was Estonian, and it was Russian. So I didn't even know for sure that it was Russian until a couple of weeks ago. So now I know a couple of things. One is that it's something traditionally used on Orenburg shawls. It's probably why they're calling it Russian grafting. And the demonstration was in some garter stitch. And it was basically the same demonstration that I saw in the sock toe with some slight differences. But in both cases, I felt like the result was very visible. Like it was a decorative, visible result. At least that's my memory of both of them. For sure in the sock toe, I can't quite remember. What I was focusing on in the one that was talking about Orenburg shawls was that the technique was executed in kind of a different order and also had a setup that the sock toe version didn't have. So I didn't know if that setup was important in one and not the other, and why the order of what was done was different. So those were things that I was going to, here are some differences in how they're being used and how the technique is executed. So I wanted to look at that. Oh, and I think I saw in some of the videos that came up that I didn't watch, I just saw in the titles that it was like crochet grafting, Russian grafting. Like it would be, one of those would be in parentheses. And in the case of these written tutorials, in both cases, they were using crochet hooks to explain how to use this technique. So I knew that there was another name for it. I knew why it probably got the name Russian grafting. So now it was time to go look at my in my reference library that I have here in my office, and I pulled out the two books that I felt were most likely to include this technique, but I also felt like they wouldn't call it Russian and they wouldn't call it grafting. And so I thought, well, crochet join, or I thought that the word crochet might be in there. I wasn't sure. So I pulled out this book. This is my very favorite knitter's reference book called The Knitter's Handbook by Montse Stanley. It's in a book called Seams and Joins. And that is really how I think of this particular technique. It's not a seam and it's not a graft. It uses live stitches like a graft does, but it's not using any working yarn. It's not using a length of yarn, and there's no yarn being used to create this join. The live stitches are being joined together without the use of additional yarn. So it's not a seam and it's not a graft, but it is a join. And so it's in her chapter on seams and joins, and she shows a really interesting way of using this join in a situation that I had never even seen before, and it was two pieces of fabric that would have loops at the selvages, and she was using this technique to join those two loops together that you'd still have a large portion of the loop, but it's just that a way of linking those two loops together all the way up. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. It'd be fascinating to see something that actually used that technique rather than just seeing the drawing of it. So the second book I looked in was the Principles of Knitting by June Hemmons Hiatt. This is meant to be an encyclopedic volume, a reference book. And again, I was pretty sure she wouldn't call it Russian or grafting, and she calls it joinery. And she has yet another way of executing this technique that is not just slightly different, but it's kind of fundamentally different from what's going on in the two online tutorials that I found. And I suspect it's going to give visually a different result. So that I'm keeping that in mind. So at this point, I know that it's called Russian grafting, probably because it's used in Orenburg shawls. And so I wanted to actually see I then searched for Orenburg shawl Russian grafting in order to see how this technique was actually used in an Orenburg shawl. And I found then I found a video, and it was a Facebook video by a Norwegian designer who lives in the UK, and I'll put her name here because I feel like it's her initials are AA, but I can't remember what it is, and I didn't write it down ahead of time. And it's very interesting, and she shows the result in an actual Orenburg-like shawl. And so you can see the finished result in yarn of that lace weight yarn. So you can see the join, but it's almost invisible. Now I can see the application of this technique in a really useful way that is not, that's pretty unobtrusive. So I could see how it was normally used, and then she demonstrated it, and she demonstrated it in such a different way. No crochet hook, but essentially doing a lot of the same things. But I need to compare the result of what she is doing to the result that I would get if I did the crochet method. And I can see why the crochet hook method is valuable in the way it was demonstrated in those other tutorials, but I can also see why it would be so much easier to do it, if possible, in the way that this Norwegian designer was showing. I have all of these different resources now. I have 5 different resources and a lot of information, and I haven't done any of the knitting yet myself. I did do a little swatch and just to see how the process worked. And so I have a plan for an experiment. And it was an experiment I was going to do and then show you the results of, but I thought that it might be more interesting for you to watch the experiment or to participate in it. So I'm going to start a discussion thread in my Ravelry group on this technique and all the variations, and we can explore them together, and you can try it out too, and we will see what happens over the next week or so with this experiment. I will include all of the references in that discussion thread, the online references, and as well as the instructions. If you don't happen to have these particular books, I will write up the instructions as they are given in these books, and also a link to the video that I saw on Facebook. And then if we find more materials that had even more variations, which I suspect that the variations are almost endless. This is the kind of experimentation that I really love, to really nail down how things work, why you might want to use them, and then go from there. So if you'd like to join in, I will leave a link down in the video description to the discussion thread that I will be creating for this experiment on Russian grafting. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group. Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.